This episode, I'm joined once again by Eric Adler to discuss the life, legacy, and work of Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer More, alongside discussions on New Humanism. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Eric Adler, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are going to be discussing a recently released book of correspondence, Humanistic Letters, the Irving Babbitt-Paul Elmer More correspondence, which was published by Missouri just this year, and big thank you to them for sending me the hardback edition, which I will say is a beautiful edition. And this is a book, as you can imagine from the title, about the correspondence between Irving Babbitt, who previously did an episode with Federici on Irving Babbitt's work, and his friendship and intellectual relationship with Paul Elmer More, who is another key figure in New Humanism, which we'll talk about. So, Irving Babbitt, we also spoke about him in our chat about the classics, but this is about their correspondence, about the development of New Humanism, about a certain form of politics in a way. It's also about, just their friendship. And there's also this peculiar relationship that both of them have to very unique perspectives on religion in there for both of them. I mean, I think this is a key factor that for myself, I thought this was quite key. But before we, get into the weeds here, just tell us about how this book came to be.
Yeah, thank you, James. I first learned about the Babbitt-Moore correspondence when I was actually working on the previous book that we had an episode on called The Battle of the Classics, which came out from 2020 from Oxford University Press. And as you suggested about our previous conversation, one chapter of that book, and to some degree the kind of linchpin of that book, was Irving Babbitt. And I focused more specifically on Irving Babbitt's educational ideas during the latter course of the Battle of the Classics, which happened in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. As part of my research for that earlier book, I went to Harvard University for a week and went and looked at the Irving Babbitt papers, which are at the Harvard University archives. And that's where I first discovered this correspondence and a typescript of most of the correspondence that had been put together by Dora Babbitt, who was Irving Babbitt's widow. And she had put this together after Babbitt's death. And I read it, quickly. I was looking for other things for that chapter, but that's where I discovered that, wow, this is a really interesting correspondence. And it's an interesting human story, an interesting narrative. It also gives you a window into the New Humanist movement and into Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer More as people and as thinkers in a way that, you can't get from merely their published work alone. And so then when I was done with most of the work for the Battle of the Classics and was looking for another intellectual project, I contacted Klaus Rinn, who's now a professor emeritus at Catholic University in the politics department, who controls access to the Irving Babbitt papers. And I asked him, do you think an edition of their correspondence would be welcome? And he agreed with me that it would be, and he sort of set me on the path of putting this together. And one of the things that I'm actually really delighted about having actually succeeded in putting out this book is that there were previous attempts to publish this correspondence that failed. So Dora Babbitt, after her husband passed away, tried to find a publisher for the correspondence. And I don't know the specifics of this, but she did not succeed. And then Harry Levin, who was the first Irving Babbitt Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard, a position he was given in 1960, also contacted Harvard University Press and asked them, would you like to put out an edition of this correspondence? I'm interested in editing it. And they said no. And so it's nice to know that after decades and decades, and really after 90 years after Irving Babbitt's death, that finally the book has actually seen the light of day. There's something welcome about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when you were reading it, for the first time, why did you feel immediately that it had this historical importance?
Well, it gives you a sense. So one of the things that they talk about a lot is the reaction to one another's writings and the reaction to other writings as well. And oftentimes they flesh out their positions in a way in their discussions with one another that they don't really do so in their actual published work. And you get a little bit of a sense of how these books and articles that they wrote came together and how they agreed and also disagreed in places about their own published work. And so it gives you a kind of insider's perspective about what they're thinking, and also sometimes even about their strategies for how to get more readers and how to get more followers and so forth, that you really can't see from their own published work. So it really does, I think, in some ways, clarify their positions on a lot of important intellectual and religious matters that you would have less of a sense of from merely reading their published work. That might be especially the case with Irving Babbitt, because on the topic of religion, he was oftentimes a little cagey about what exactly he believed. More became, at least when he became a Christian apologist in the 1920s, became more forthcoming about that. But Babbitt was a little kind of hard to read exactly what were his views on Christianity, what were his views on Buddhism, what were his views on religion. He doesn't really, he says, but it's also kind of hard to figure out from his published work alone. The Correspondence gives you a much better sense of what Babbitt's actual views are on some of those topics. So they're able to be franker with one another sometimes than they could feel like they could be in their published work.
I think a few of the letters more calls Babbitt out on that, actually, about in his written work. Babbitt has this style which is almost semi-aphoristic, where he'll write these paragraphs where he feels the compulsion to sum everything up every single time, and then throughout the book you have to sort of go back and try piece the argument together, because he's kind of like he's a great writer, but he's often a bit panicked, and I think more sort of says the same thing that you said there of, you know, what we keep losing the thread and having to regain it, even though it's very readable. It's kind of a strange style.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the things that's sort of frustrating about Babbitt, because when you read individual sentences, he's really funny. He can really encapsulate things beautifully. He's exceedingly learned. I mean, he's read sort of everything and more the same way. And yet he seemed like when he was a writer, it appears as if as an arguer, he wasn't like this. But as a writer, he had a really hard time understanding what it was like not to know the things he already knew. And so he really orders his arguments poorly. And he sort of, it's hard to go from point A to point B to point C and so forth. He tends not to do that. Instead, he sort of goes around and around and around. And you really have to read lots of his work in order to piece together what he actually believes and what the argument really is. And I think in a way, in his letters, although he oftentimes isn't as clear about that either, because Moore agreed with him so much that they didn't have to talk about the A, B, C stuff. But he is clearer in many cases about what he actually believes and how he's put things together sometimes than he is in his published work.
Well, to sort of, I guess, lay a foundation of this correspondence of what it's covering in the broadest sense. I mean, New Humanism is probably something that in the chat with Federici and also the previous chat with yourself is probably something we've touched upon. But New Humanism is sort of the groundwork that these two thinkers really are dealing with throughout their career. But also, so I guess, one, what is New Humanism? And also, two, what years are we, what era are we dealing with here with this correspondence?
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. So the New Humanism is the label. Sometimes it's called American Humanism. This was maybe bigger in England as a name or what have you. Babbitt didn't like either of those terms. He just liked humanism. So he didn't really like new or anything like that. He was sort of wrong about this, I guess. We didn't like the addition of new because he felt like he was part of this tradition. But the New Humanism is the name given to an informal movement of literary and social criticism. It was led by Irving Babbitt, who lived from 1865 to 1933, and Paul Elmer Moore, who was always a little bit more at arm's length about a movement. He was not really a follower of a movement, but he's very strongly associated with this and was, Irving Babbitt's best friend. And he lived from 1864 to 1937. So we're really talking about a movement that kind of gets going in the late 1890s, but is really a bigger deal in the early decades of the 20th century, especially in the 1920s and 1930s when it becomes kind of big. Big in American intellectual circles and even in European intellectual circles. The movement really originated with Irving Babbitt, who, rather surprisingly, and this shows you the kind of intellect we're dealing with, had essentially cobbled together the basic building blocks of the new humanism when he was a college undergraduate in the 1880s, which he sort of added to the movement over the course of time, but really basically the essentials appear to have been there in the 1880s, which is really kind of amazing, I think it's safe to say. And the movement was a relationship that Babbitt sort of spied between the historical humanistic movement as it existed originally in Roman antiquity and was first articulated as a kind of theoretical movement by Cicero in the first century BCE, but then also revivified and altered to some degree in the Italian Renaissance and so forth. So he's linked to that, but also he was interested in using humanism, as earlier humanists were as well, as a kind of way of life. It's a kind of philosophy of life. And he had cobbled together a more philosophically precise rationale for why this was a useful movement and a useful way to live your life. At the same time, Babbitt, and maybe this relates to the kind of adjective new being added to this, he was also a very ecumenical thinker who was very broad-minded, especially for his era, and was really interested in moving beyond the kind of historical confines of the humanistic tradition, which was highly classical and kind of Greco-Roman and then Italian and so forth, and sort of seen as Western. And he tried to suggest that important thinkers from other traditions, especially from the Far East, had come up with similar approaches to life that he called humanistic. And so he perceived that Confucius and Buddha were humanists of a sort, Oriental humanists rather than Occidental humanists, but humanists as well. So there was also a desire to try to make this a kind of more capacious movement, and a kind of world movement rather than something that was a specifically kind of Western or Greco-Roman kind of movement. And so this movement was also kind of added to, in a sense, when Babbitt met Moore. Both of them in the 1890s were fellow graduate students of Sanskrit, Pali, and Indian philosophy at Harvard. And they became best friends when they were in class together. They were in a class of two people with the professor. So this became a sort of easier for them to have a friendship. And Moore was sort of converted to Babbitt's way of life during this friendship in the 1890s when they were both at Harvard, but also seems to have kind of augmented the movement. Moore was very interested in dualism, ethical dualism, and this was a sort of part of humanism from the beginning, but I think Moore probably brought it out further than what Babbitt had come together. So the two of them ended up being associated with this movement that ended up having various followers and, various people, second generation humanists and so forth, very influential in intellectual circles, especially in the United States, but also in Europe to some degree as well, over the course of their lives. And then ultimately in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, it became this kind of cause célèbre where people were really interested in the movement more generally. Overall, I would say, to talk about this kind of quickly, that the new humanism was an approach to literature and life that was very focused on ethical dualism and the idea that human beings naturally have both higher impulses, but also lower impulses, and that it's important for those people to learn how to rein in their lower impulses and allow their higher impulses to flourish in order for them to live satisfying and happy lives. And so the movement was seen as deeply critical of romanticism, especially in the kind of Jean-Jacques Rousseau vision, which has a totally different approach to life, according to which Rousseau believed human beings are naturally good and their impulses are naturally good, and therefore they should just embrace their natural impulses. And it's society and it's malign institutions that leads to badness and so forth, not natural impulses. And then linked to this was what Babbitt called scientific naturalism, which is a movement he associated with Francis Bacon, in which one avoids the concern for character development of the individual and instead focuses on increasing human mastery over the natural world in the movement toward ineluctable progress of society and greater creature comforts and longer lives and more comfort in general. Babbitt was not opposed, and Moore was not opposed to some elements of Romanticism. They were deeply critical of Romanticism, but they weren't totally carte blanche critics of Romanticism. And they also saw great value in scientific discoveries and so forth. They were not anti-science guys by any means, but they believed that a kind of twin romanticism or sentimental naturalism mixed with scientific naturalism that wasn't in any way leavened by a spirit of humanism was a recipe for human misery, number one, and also for civilizational disaster. It was going to lead to greater conflict and so forth. And so they believed that humanism was deeply important for human happiness and civilizational progress.
So the difference then between new humanism and the humanism of today, which seems to be just somewhat of a fairly floating signifier of something that we're not. It's sort of subsumed into the secular movement with Dawkins and Hitchens and all these people. And it seems that removal of something that Babbitt and Moore would have written about, which is the removal of the spirit, the removal of the soul, quite literally happened in that transition to just what we understand as humanism now, which ironically is quite a utilitarian movement in the sense of just going to, I mean, they have little more than going towards that happiness, which Babbitt would say, well, you need to, have an inner check and you need to develop your character instead of just ceaselessly having little more than, than that sort of striving for happiness. So it's just to try put that difference there of, even though Babbitt was reluctant to call it new humanism, I think maybe today he would have to say, okay, there's a difference.
Yeah, and I would also say that even, and you can read this, Literature in the American College, Essays in Defense of the Humanities, which is Babbitt's first book, was published in 1908. The first chapter of it, he's already talking about these huge confusions that people have about humanism and what it actually means versus humanitarianism, and that people sometimes use one for the other and so forth. So even in Babbitt's day, well before our own time, there was a kind of muddying of what humanism meant, and a more general sense that humanism sounded like a kind of pleasant thing. It's good to be a humanist as opposed to an anti-humanist, I suppose. And so a lot of people claimed the mantle of humanism and used it to mean different things. And I think Babbitt found that frustrating as somebody who was interested in using humanism to advance his own kind of personal philosophy of life, but also who saw, I think correctly, that philosophy of life as actually being linked to the historical humanist movement. And so I think one of the things that he was bothered by was people who kind of called themselves humanists, but didn't really know anything about the historical humanist movement, and were using the term humanism to mean things that are wildly different from sort of what Cicero articulated or Petrarch articulated and so forth. So he felt like there was a kind of ahistorical way of looking at things. And people like John Dewey, who was very much an opponent of Irving Babbitt, considered himself a humanist of a sort. Richard Dawkins, you mentioned, is, the term in some senses became kind of meaningless because anyone used it as like sort of any concern with human values is seen as humanist. And therefore, and it's kind of pleasant sounding. And so you can use it for that reason. But I think you're right that there is a kind of fundamental spiritual concern that Babbitt and Moore articulated even before Moore's return to Christianity, and also a desire to link their philosophy of life to the historical humanist movement that really makes them much more associated with that tradition than many other people who are called or call themselves humanists today.
So would you say that the development of new humanism between the two thinkers was equal? Because I mean, we've been speaking a lot about Babbitt here, and Moore hasn't really Moore is the figure that we haven't really touched too much upon in terms of his own work. I mean, would you consider the development equal? I guess from the Correspondence.
Yeah, I guess I sort of wouldn't. I think that Babbitt was more the originator of it. Moore added to it. I don't want to suggest that he was some passive cheerleader or something like that. I mean, he was a very brilliant man as well, very far-seeing man, very well-read man as well. And he did, I think, add to the development of it in certain ways too. But I do think that there's something fundamentally different about their intellectual biographies that makes Moore's partial parting with New Humanism in the 1920s less surprising than you might think from the kind of published accounts of them, where if you read stuff about Babbitt and Moore, as long as it's not crazy, I mean, there's some stuff that's written about them that's just totally crazy that comes from culture warriors of the day who don't understand what they were doing and so forth. But Moore is very different in some ways. Although he's associated with the New Humanist movement, and he was for decades, in some ways his entire life, his entire published life, he's sort of associated with those ideas. And many of his philosophical cues come from Babbitt, I think it's safe to say. At the same period of time, there's a real difference in the way that they saw one another. And I think Moore talks about this in his post-mortem estimation of Babbitt. Babbitt was very fixed in his intellectual life, that in college he'd kind of cobbled together the basic building blocks of this philosophy, and he basically stuck to it throughout his entire life. Now, he added to it, he added vast sums of knowledge. He also became, I think, more ecumenical in his approach over time than he maybe was at the very start, although there was an ecumenical portion to his writings from the very beginning. Moore was much more, as I talked about in the introduction to the book, a kind of intellectual seeker who moved around a lot more in his intellectual world and in his religious world. So he was, as a boy, he was a strict Calvinist because that's the tradition he came from. He broke away from that and he became kind of a romanticist of a sort. He became very interested in Hinduism and Hindu mysticism. He met Babbitt and then became kind of interested in humanism and kind of moved in that direction and shed his romanticism. And then over time, he became more interested in Christianity again. And so there are intellectual constants in Moore's life. I mean, very much a concern with ethical dualism is something that you see from this very early published work all the way to the end. But he really did have a number of kind of intellectual and spiritual perambulations over the course of his life that Babbitt never really had. And so the two of them are, although they were best friends and they're seen as the leaders of this particular movement, they're very different kind of intellectual figures. Over the course of their lives in some respects. And, Moore is much more a seeker moving in different directions, and Babbitt is much more fixed, I think.
The Parmenides and Heraclitus of New Humanism. Does Babbitt comment on Moore's sort of, I guess you could call it spiritual, sort of spiritual nomadism, right? This kind of constant movement. Does he comment on that?
Yeah, so by the 1920s, the early 1920s, Moore had moved back to Christianity. And this series that he had started with a book called Platonism that was published in 1917 when Moore was still not a Christian, morphed into a series of books called The Greek Tradition, which was a series of books that Moore wrote that became a series of Christian apologetics. And Moore moved in the direction of a kind of Platonic semi-Anglicanism, and in favor of Christianity as a superior religion to other religions. And specifically, his kind of heterodox approach to Protestantism was, the way he moved. Babbitt didn't like that because Babbitt was always, I don't know if he was ever a Christian, maybe even as a boy, I'm not entirely sure. Babbitt was someone you would consider interested in the religious impulse, but was always highly ecumenical in his approach to revealed religion. I think he believed that various important religions throughout the world had similar spiritual truths that they could pass on to their followers. And it's not that these religions were precisely the same. I mean, he wasn't an idiot. He recognized that they were different. But at the same period of time, he did recognize that there were certain kinds of spiritual truths that you could get from Buddhism or from Hinduism or from Judaism or from Christianity. And it mattered less to him which one of those you were dedicated to, if you were dedicated to any at all, as opposed to this kind of wisdom of the ages. And he became angry, I think, with Moore, because Moore was suddenly starting to write about the superiority of Anglicanism to other religious faiths, and also about the requirement that someone who considers himself or herself a humanist has to be a Christian in order for this really to be a useful movement. Babbitt was interested in trying to make humanism or new humanism as attractive as possible to people of a variety of different faith traditions, including no faith tradition, including those who were atheists or agnostics and so forth. And so he thought that Moore was kind of muddying the message of humanism by suddenly coming out and becoming this prominent Christian apologist who was actually articulating some of the criticisms of the humanist movement that other kind of right-wing Christians had offered about humanism more generally. So G.K. Chesterton or T.S. Eliot had also articulated some criticisms, Alan Tate, a number as well, suggesting that, what's this humanism? If you don't have Christianity, it's not really serious and so forth. And so Babbitt got really distressed that the best writer in the humanist movement, because Paul Moore did not have the kind of problems with his prose style that Irving Babbitt had. I mean, Paul Moore was a really beautiful lyrical writer, and he was the most prominent, even though Babbitt now today is probably better known, I think it's safe to say, than Moore. Moore was the more prominent person at the time because he had written more for the popular press. He was a serious candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature twice and so forth. He was a very prominent guy. And then suddenly he becomes the guy who's articulating a number of the sort of right-wing Christian criticisms of humanism. And Babbitt, who was desperate to make this into a movement, was really upset with Moore, and Moore's view was like, oh, we're not as far off from one another as you think, and so forth. So the latter part, before Babbitt gets sick, the latter part of their correspondence, you see a lot of their fights over religious topics, in which Moore is talking of defending his kind of Christian and Protestant and semi-Anglican approach to faith, and criticizing other approaches to faith, including Buddhism. And Babbitt, who was kind of near being a Buddhist, not taking that very well. And so that's sort of part of the fun, I guess, of the correspondence, is you get to see the two of them go after one another in the 1920s over these kind of important religious issues.
Did this find a resolution? Did they fall out, or did it find a resolution?
No, there was never a falling out, really. They remained best friends throughout their lives. I do surmise in the introduction, and I think it's true from looking over the correspondence, that Paul Elmer More may have tried to lessen Babbitt's possibility of offering full feedback to his work once he moved back to Christianity. Babbitt was a kind of contentious, argumentative chap. And although he was best friends with Moore, I think Moore didn't really want to have these fights so much. Mm-hmm. And so he may have kind of tried to move a little bit in the direction of not getting as much feedback from Babbitt. I think Babbitt perceived that there was a greater intellectual break between them than Moore thought there actually was. He thought their positions were more compatible than Babbitt thought, whereas Babbitt really didn't think so. But the two of them remained best friends throughout their lives. Moore was, the other thing I talk about a little bit in the introduction, and I think you can see earlier on the correspondence, they never really fully saw eye to eye on religious matters from the start. So it's not like suddenly in the 1920s they had this break. Now, the break was much more serious once Paul Elmer More moved back to Christianity. But at the same period of time, they never really fully saw eye to eye on a lot of matters. It was just colored over because they agreed on so much. So no, they remained friends throughout their lives, and they felt warmly about one another. But I do think that there's a sense of disappointment that Babbitt had about various what he saw as defections or semi-defections from his ranks. And I think Moore didn't see himself as a defector, but I think Babbitt partly did, but there were other defections as well. T.S. Eliot kind of partly defected for some of the same reasons that Paul Elmer More did. Stuart Sherman, who moved in very different directions, was a sort of second generation humanist. He also kind of partly defected from the movement as well. So Babbitt was disappointed by a lot of things, and I think Moore's semi-move away from humanism was one of the greatest blows, I think, to him intellectually.
It's often said that the major disagreements between thinkers or between factions or sides isn't, when you have A versus B, when you have like the clearest disagreement imaginable. Those ones usually both sides accept, we're probably never going to get a resolution, let's talk.
Yeah.
It's always when two people agree 99% of the time, but there's this 1%, and they end up hating each other over the 1%. And it interests me, do you think this disagreement regarding the spiritual side of things, because dualism is always a factor for both of these thinkers, do you think it's sort of was a worldly disagreement or something, a bit of a cliche, but something deeper on a more of a spiritual level, more of a theological level, which is a bit more abstract and hard to pin down? Was it, Babbitt sort of seeing that more in his movement towards these things is actually getting caught up in something a bit more worldly, a bit more sort of, as you said, sort of Christian far right, and moving away from the more holistic nature of Babbitt? Or, is it worldly or is it more spiritual?
I guess, a sort of boring but probably true answer is both. I think it's safe to say. So that there were pragmatic elements of this. And again, I should stress that the two of them never became enemies or, had rival factions or anything like that. They were still ideological allies, I think, and intellectual allies throughout their lives, even though they had certain things to hash out. But I think that there was both a pragmatic rationale behind the two of them sort of semi-splitting over this, but then there was also a much more profound intellectual, spiritual nature to it as well. On the pragmatic side, I think that Paul Elmer More was never really someone who wanted to be associated with a movement in a way. He didn't see himself that way. he was a little more blasé about fame and, personal concerns and so forth. And, there's a discussion even in the correspondence that Babbitt feels like the way in which Moore wrote his books and self-presented was maybe not maximally attractive to getting good reviews and having a kind of movement associated with him. He called most of his books just Shelburne essays, volume 8, and whatever. And he seemed like kind of blasé about the reviews and so forth. Moore was never really it's weird because his reputation is he's a new humanist and he was part of this movement. He's one of the fathers of it, but he was never really kind of a follower in a way and never really wanted to start a movement. I mean, he had strong opinions, but he was never really interested in being part of a school of thought or anything like that, even though if you read his writing, I mean, he sort of is associated with that. Babbitt, I think, was not really interested in personal prominence either. He didn't really care that much about whether people cited him and named him or anything like that. But he really wanted to start this movement. He thought that the new humanism was a really important approach to life that could actually make people happier and could lead to a more peaceful and happy world as well. So he was really interested in presenting humanism in a way that was maximally attractive to readers of a variety of different stripes. And I think that's one of the reasons why he got so frustrated with Moore's move toward Anglicanism is better than other religious faiths. It's like, well, what am I going to do with that? That's not going to be attractive to people who aren't Anglican. So do we really want to make this movement only appeal to Anglicans and everybody else can just go away? That's not really going to help. And in some ways, Babbitt was genuinely ecumenical in that he thought that there was a kind of common humanity and there's a kind of common human wisdom, and that was really important for leading a kind of more irenic life more generally. And then if we make this into a splinter group that's associated with one religious tradition overall, it's just not going to be as effective overall. So I think that's sort of the pragmatic dimension, but that also bleeds into the more spiritual dimension. Babbitt was just a much more ecumenical thinker in many ways than Moore, I think, ever was, even when Moore was closer to Hinduism. They had similarities, and, Moore also talks about the Platonic problem of the one and the many and so forth. But I think that Moore was just more like those of his own time than Babbitt was. Babbitt was so strangely and interestingly ecumenical and syncretistic in his impulses for a thinker from the early 20th century. Moore had inclinations in that direction, but he wasn't as ecumenical as Babbitt sort of ever was, I think. And so there was a profoundly different sense of religion that the two of them ultimately offered, where I think Moore felt like Babbitt really wasn't a religious believer. He sort of believed in Buddhism without God or something like that. And this wasn't really fundamentally serious. And I think Babbitt felt like, Moore, it's perfectly fine. It wasn't like Babbitt was anti-Christian or anything like that. He thought it was perfectly fine to be an Anglican, but sort of to write about why Anglicanism is superior to other kinds of faiths, this is a sort of disaster for the humanistic movement overall. So it was both, I think, pragmatic and sort of intellectual, spiritual at the same time.
Did that disagreement then overflow in terms of what both thinkers understood the respective ends could be? Maybe Moore's movement, the respective ends in terms of how new humanism is going to enter into society and change society. Babbitt understands that it genuinely can make people happier, hence his emphasis on it being a movement. And perhaps it is that Moore moves away because he sees maybe there seems to me, I'm not sure why I think this is much, seems to me a difference in kind in terms of how both of them are probably approaching suffering in the world. Buddhism on the one hand, I mean, Buddhism without God is a bit of a horror story in a way, but Buddhism on the one hand with that understanding of an acceptance of suffering and a learning to deal with it and a move forward from it, if I'm getting my Buddhism right. I mean, there's plenty of bad Western appreciations. And then Anglicanism on the other side of bearing a cross of suffering, playing a role of something that is just going to be in the world. That seems to be a possible reason for the split there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but that seems like they could be part of it. I also think that there's a sense in which, even though they really saw eye to eye about human nature in some respects, that there also might be some differences in the way that they perceive what was necessary for human beings to live up to their higher potentialities. Moore later, when he moved toward Christianity and became a Christian apologist, really believed that humanism without a religious undergirding is kind of useless. Because why would someone be interested in living up to their higher impulses if they don't have hell to pay when they die afterwards? If there isn't a serious threat, right? Yeah. So if there isn't a serious threat of something very bad happening to them in the afterlife for them having been bad people, why would they actually try to be good? So this becomes More's ultimate position as he moves to back to Christianity. Babbitt's response to that was, well, if you look at the largest flourishing of the humanistic movement, he perceives ancient Greece, even though it sort of predates the first articulation of it, to be, that. And also he sees Confucian China as also strongly humanistic in its sort of approach to the world. Those are approaches to life that Babbitt perceived not really buoyed by religious faith in any way. And yet they are strong humanistic eras, if you will. So Babbitt felt like you could find examples of people living up to their higher potentials, or at least believing in the importance of that, who were not religious, or at least not Christians. And so that More was fundamentally wrong about that. I also think in a more pragmatic sense, Babbitt recognized that American intellectual culture in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century was becoming increasingly secular. The Origin of Species had been published in 1859, and so many people dropped their religious faith and moved in the direction of secularism. And Babbitt felt like if you link humanism to some revealed religion and suggest that you need revealed religion in order to be a humanist, that this was not going to be attractive to the vast majority of American intellectuals and potential leaders in society. So he needed to present this philosophy of life as a way that could be valuable to live regardless of whether you're Catholic or you're Anglican or you're Presbyterian or you're Jewish or you're agnostic or you're an atheist. All people could gain from this perspective on life. And I'm not sure More completely disagreed with that, but I do think that message got muddied by More's movement toward Christian apologetics. And Babbitt saw that as a fundamental mistake on More's part for the movement, especially because More was really the most prominent writer associated with the movement during his lifetime.
I'm going to assume More didn't, but did Babbitt have a relationship with atheism? Did he have an atheism phase, or did he always have some sort of belief?
No, I think Babbitt always thought atheism was wrong. He always on the side, he sort of says, he's on the side of the supernaturalists, not on those who oppose supernaturalism overall. But he was never seemingly a real believer in revealed religion kind of at all. He had this very ecumenical kind of, there are certain spiritual truths in the world and you can access them from different religious traditions. He just never was a believer in, this sort of dogma associated with particular faiths. And so it's not surprising, I guess, that he's most interested in a kind of lesser vehicle version of Buddhism that's stripped of all mythological baggage, that may not even need a god. It might be more about sort of one's own internal struggle. That's kind of more of his bag. But Babbitt and More in the correspondence will talk a little bit about their friend and fellow humanist, a guy named Frank Jewett Mather, who was the kind of third kind of member of the kind of inner circle of first generation humanists. And Mather had very different political inclinations. He became a socialist and so forth. He was best buddies with Babbitt and More. And he also became a kind of agnostic or possibly an atheist. It's sort of harder to tell. And Babbitt and More, although they really loved Mather, they were buddies, they are rather critical of his approach. And they felt like there's something missing. He has no sense of the religious sense at all. He lacks the religious sense. So I think both Babbitt and More agreed that that's a sort of fundamental element of the human experience. They just had different approaches to it overall.
So how did Babbitt reconcile, the I guess the ever increasing secularism of the day, going the early 1900s onwards, with the need for an inner check, with the need for that dualism? I mean, what did he have an answer back then for? Well, here's reasons why, even if you don't believe in God, you should develop your character and not just head towards complete base desires.
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly, and I think More didn't, or More largely agreed with him about this too, is that Babbitt was not just critical of the increasing drift towards secularism, and in fact, he wasn't deeply critical of that in some respects. He was actually rather critical of what he perceived to be the perversion of various religious traditions to become not humanistic and to become humanitarian instead. So he believed that many Christian churches had kind of moved away from a concern with one's own spiritual welfare and one's own attempt to live up to the best version of yourself. And instead, the church became a concern for public works. How can we go out and, a bake sale and try to help this and that and so forth. And so there was a movement away from one's own personal salvation toward the same kind of humanitarianism, or I think what Babbitt should have called pseudo-humanitarianism, because neither man was actually opposed to helping other people. They thought that this was actually central to living a good life. But the kind of pseudo-humanitarianism that you might see today on Twitter, say, when someone just says, I'm very concerned about what's happening in Israel or something like that, and then doing nothing about it. Mm-hmm. That a lot of religious organizations, a lot of churches, a lot of synagogues and so forth were moving away from their own religious traditions, which Babbitt perceived to be humanistic to some degree, and moving toward the kind of Rousseauistic, sympathetic concern for the plight of humanity or something like that in its place. So I think that both Babbitt and Moore were concerned about a kind of increasing secularism and what that might mean for culture to some degree, but maybe even more about what they perceived to be the perversion of religious traditions to kind of go along with the sort of romanticism that they actually disliked from the very start.
Wow. I will comment. I mean, I think they were completely on the money. I mean, that's pretty much what we still see going on in a lot of religious traditions today, these sort of public face acts, which are, they don't seem to be tethered to the soul and to salvation. They don't seem to acknowledge the notion of the rationale and reason for undertaking any of these acts, is for almost like a bolstering of the soul, if you want to put it that way, or for ultimately your salvation. And when you move away from that, you do have to sort of acknowledge the question of, well, in all seriousness, it's very easy to say, well, a good act is a good act, but you can only say that if you have some notion of the dualistic good. And if you don't have that, well, why do any of these things at all? And so that decentering or that complete destruction of even in a metaphorical sense, I guess, of the soul, though I think it'd probably be very real for both these thinkers, once that's gone, you're left with, I don't know, what are you left with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable enough about contemporary religious life in the United States or the UK or elsewhere really to comment on sort of precisely what different churches are doing and precisely what different synagogues and mosques and so forth. But there might be a general truth, I think you might agree with this, James, that if what you're getting from going to church, say, or going to a synagogue, say, is not really different from what you might get from living in secular society in general, why are you going? If a sermon is going to look quite like what you're going to read on Twitter, and people saying that they're deeply concerned about, what's going on in the world without any kind of concomitant requirement that you actually better yourself, then what's the rationale for going to begin with? I mean, maybe that just they have a religious impulse and they come from particular traditions, they need this. And at least in the United States, you do see signs that a number of churches and so forth have lessening membership. And there could be lots of reasons for this. I'm not suggesting that there's, but there could be a sense in which people really don't feel like the message they're getting at their own religious institutions is really fundamentally different from what they're getting in school or what they're getting on Twitter or on Facebook or what have you. And so people are not really seeing these things as serious guides to life in some sense. And so maybe Babbitt and Moore were onto something in that regard.
Do you think that thing that's missing or has been slowly altered into just the same as society was or should be the sacred, what we would call the sacred?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, again, I haven't really fully thought this out, but I do think that there's a sense in which, as Babbitt talks about, there was in the humanistic tradition, broadly conceived, not just in the West, but with Confucius and Buddha and various other, you could see this in lots of other traditions. There was a concern for virtue and the performance of virtuous acts and actually being selfless as best you can and reining in your worst impulses and so forth. And I do think you can see in contemporary society, and I think Babbitt and Moore tried to argue that you could see it in their day too, that there was a movement away, largely thanks to romanticism, perhaps, of the kind of Rousseauistic type, away from virtue being seen, the performance of virtuous acts, oftentimes against one's own best self-interest, toward the kind of self-advertisement of one's sympathy for humanity as a whole, which allows people to think that they're good people without actually having to do anything. So, and we talked about this a little bit toward the end of our last discussion about my previous book, The Battle of the Classics, that people can think that putting up a yard sign that says, "In this house, we believe that science is real," and so forth, is some sort of replacement for actually being good to your neighbor. Or being selfless in any particular way. Now, I'm not suggesting that people who put up those yard signs necessarily are like that. I've got no idea. But I do think that there's a general sense in which people are more interested, because it's so much easier, in self-advertising their virtue than actually being virtuous. And I do think that Babbitt and Moore may have hit upon why that's so, that why this fundamental change in the notion of virtue has been so important. I mean, obviously, social media drives this in particular ways because people's self-advertisement becomes so important to them if they can be on Facebook or on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. But I think that there might be a more general sense in which people are trying to do morality on the cheap, if you will. To seem like a great moral person without actually having to do any of the self-sacrifice necessary to do anything that's really fundamentally moral. And I think that that's true of people from a variety of different political inclinations. That's also true of people from a variety of different faith traditions or no faith tradition at all. I think that you could see that in Babbitt and Moore's day. That's one of the things that they were complaining about very deeply. And maybe you can even see that more in our own day, especially with social media today.
That's what I was going to comment. I mean, it seems they were on the money, and it seems that tendency only accelerated. So that does make me want to ask the question. I mean, what was the end, the conclusion for both of these figures, and then what happened to the legacy of New Humanism? I'm going to possibly assume that as it sort of 1937 would be when Moore passes away. So, it's pushed up right against World War II. Did that then have this immediate effect of sort of, I guess, dampening the excitement around it that was there?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I was interested in publishing the Correspondence and also interested in writing the Battle of the Classics beforehand is I did get this general sense that even though Irving Babbitt is known to some degree among intellectual historians, and he's cited a great deal, especially in the literature on American higher education and so forth, they were famous in their day, and they're not really famous anymore. And I think that their ideas are more important than many people have recognized. Their ideas got caricatured. When they became famous in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, a number of culture warriors wrote about them. And I think especially because Babbitt was not an easy writer to read, they oftentimes ran roughshod over what he actually was arguing. And they came up with this idea that he was some sort of fascist or something. It was just absurd. I mean, he was not at all attracted to that kind of stuff, very dovish in his approach and very critical of nationalism and so forth. But there became this kind of common parlance that these two guys were kind of reactionaries or conservatives of some sort, which they didn't really see themselves as, I think, or at least Babbitt certainly didn't see himself as at all. And so I think that they deserve greater attention than they've received. I try to argue in my introduction that they're among the two most important intellectual or literary and social critics in American history. And I really do believe that that's true, even though I think that there are many things that they made mistakes about or problems of emphasis. And there's lots of stuff you can criticize about their views. I'm not some total true believer in their school of thought. So there are plenty of things to criticize, but I do think that they deserve to be better known. One of the reasons I think they're less well known is because the Great Depression came. So even before World War II, both men were kind of Burkean, I think, in their approach to politics. And they were very much anti-socialist, and they were kind of anti-statist. They believed much more than I do in a kind of very minimal domestic governance that went along with their more dovish approach to foreign policy. once the Great Depression comes in, that approach to politics on the domestic front is going to become very unpopular as people start to move toward different sorts of more radical solutions for the problems associated with the Great Depression. So there's going to be a much more focus on communism and on socialism, kind of from the left. And on the right, there's a movement toward distributism and in some cases fascism or monarchism and so forth. And so they're more kind of humdrum kind of anti-statism becomes much less popular, I think it's safe to say. And then the other issue, I think, is that they became less prominent in part because they had been so ruthlessly attacked, and in many cases very unfairly attacked when they became famous figures, that they became kind of less respectable in some sense, unless you were an intellectual conservative. And I think that that is unfair because they have lots to say to people of different political inclinations, not just people who are conservative. Babbitt did not consider himself a conservative either. And so actually, especially in our day, when you see these huge attacks on the humanities and the movement in the direction of vocationalism in American and really world education overall, the kind of philosophical message that Babbitt and Moore articulated, especially perhaps Babbitt, but Moore too, about the danger of moving away from the liberal arts and moving away from the humanities and a concern for character is perhaps more important than ever, maybe more important than in their own day, because the humanities were better off in those days than they were in our own day. So I really do feel like they have lots to teach us today, and it's really unfair in some sense that they did not get the full credit that they deserved for the important movement that they put together.
Do you feel the humanities that we have today has attempted over time to model itself off, what we now know as STEM? It's tried to transform, it's a shift really from qualification or quality to an attempt to quantify the humanities, basically.
Yes. No, not only do I think that's happening in our own day, I think that was happening since Babbitt and Moore's day, actually. And that's one thing that Babbitt is very critical of. Moore is too, in much of his published writing, about how the humanities have kind of moved away from humanism, a concern with human values, a concern with learning from the past and thinking through life's great questions in order to live a good life, toward a kind of scientific naturalism, a movement toward very narrow research that sees itself as scientific in a way that's supposed to move toward the inevitable progress of society, that's not concerned about human values really in any sort of fundamental way, but that sees itself as kind of scientistic. Babbitt and Moore both criticized what they called the philological syndicate in their day, which was a move towards, highly scientific style philology that came from the German universities, the research universities, and became all the rage during Babbitt and Moore's day in the late 19th century. They thought that the concern for accuracy associated with the philologists was laudable, but the rest of it was the most trifling garbage that no one would be interested in their entire lives. And so Babbitt was critical of, say, a class by his colleague, ultimately, George Lyman Kittredge at Harvard. He was a real hardcore scientific philologist who focused on every interesting aspect about Shakespeare except for what Shakespeare has to say about humane values. So everything except for what's most important about Shakespeare is what the philologists actually focus on. You see, and Babbitt actually talks about this, Moore talks about this as well, when the American colleges were turned into the American university movement, there was a fundamental shift in the curriculum that was essentially moving away from the humanities and theology as the center of the college curriculum in the direction of the scientific method being the heart of the college curriculum. That's what Babbitt and Moore had to deal with in their day, and that's what we have to deal with in our day as well. So the problems they articulated philosophically with that change, those are still with us, and so their criticisms are more valuable, I think, than ever.
So what we can really learn from them is to learn what is now much worse and much more potent in our own day, is to learn, the arguments that they were making when that whole process was beginning. So go and read them for that. I mean, we all have spoken before about, where to start with Babbitt on the podcast, but Moore, as you said, I mean, he titles his things just collections of lectures. But where would one begin with More's work if you wanted to read his work?
It sort of depends on what about More you're most interested in, because there are some people who are most interested in him as a Christian apologist, say, and then they would probably start with, I think, either the Greek tradition, which is 5 volumes, so it's a lot to get through, or a book he wrote called The Skeptical Approach to Religion. So if you're interested in More's movement back toward Christianity, his arguments in favor of a kind of heterodox Platonic semi-Anglicanism, that's probably what you're interested in. If you're more interested in More as a kind of literary critic, you'd probably want to start with the first series of Shelburne essays, which was published in the early, I think, 1904, if I remember correctly, is the first Shelburne, and then sort of start moving in the direction of reading other essays by him afterwards. If you're more interested in More's approach to philosophy, there might be particular installments of the Shelburne essays that might be more interesting to you than others, and so forth. There's certain essays that are perhaps more important. There's also, I think, a book called The Essential Paul Elmer More, which is a collection of various different essays he wrote of different sorts. That might be a nice way in one volume of getting a kind of general sense of what he was capable of and so forth. But for me, I think if you're interested in his literary and to a lesser degree social criticism, you'd probably want to start with the first volume of Shelburne's and then sort of move on from there.
Well, we've covered this history and we've covered these two figures, I think, fairly well. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add about this correspondence that you feel is key?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that maybe doesn't shine through unless you read the entire thing, because I think a lot of people will read it, they're researchers, they're interested in intellectual history from the early 20th century and so forth, and which is fine. I mean, that's wonderful, and interested in Babbitt and more generally as thinkers and so forth, and what was going on in their movement and their lives and so forth. But one thing that I was really initially struck by, and maybe I kind of talked about this a little bit toward the beginning of our discussion, but I think I want to underscore, is that the correspondence also gives you a kind of human story. The two men, these are two people that we're more likely, especially because they died, 90 years ago or so, or 80 something years ago or so, that these are just kind of, thinkers that, who wrote works that we can read today and so forth. And one sense you get from their correspondence is that these are real people who live lives, who had disappointments and triumphs in their own lives, who got sick or family members got sick. There's a discussion that, Babbitt's younger sister, whom he revered, was killed in a car accident. She was hit by a car. And there's a sort of discussion about that and about sort of life and death. Babbitt gets sick toward the end of the correspondence, and More, who's his best friend, is really upset about this and so forth. And so you really get a sense of this being a human story in a way that I think if you read their published work, you're just less likely to see. And especially with kind of figures who lived a long time ago, who are great intellects and started a movement, we're likely to see them not so much as human beings. The correspondence forces you to see them as human beings as well.
That's great. Well, we will be able to find Humanistic Letters on, I'm assuming, the Missouri website and other places online. Are you now going to be working on more Babbitt?
Actually, I'm currently in the very beginning stages of trying to write the first biography of Irving Babbitt that's ever been written. And it's probably going to take me forever, in part because I'm currently chair of my department. And so I have so much administrative work that I have much less time for research. So that's part of it. But also because, as I've discovered, that the Irving Babbitt papers at Harvard are 33,000 pages strong, and that there's lots of other letters between Babbitt and others, or people associated with the circle from various other archives and so forth, too, all of which I have to get my hand on in order to try to write something. So it's probably, I wouldn't save up your pennies yet for that book. It's probably going to take forever for me to do. But there are a number of intellectual biographies of Babbitt. Mm-hmm. And there is a full biography of Paul Elmer More. A guy named Arthur Dakin, Hazard Dakin Jr., wrote a book in 1960. It's just called Paul Elmer More, and it goes through his life. No one has tried to write an actual biography of Babbitt. Mm-hmm. And although there is obviously, I never met Babbitt, he died 40 years before I was born and so forth. There's all kinds of problems with trying to do that now. No one who lived and met Irving Babbitt is still alive today. So there's certain ways in which this is going to be a different sort of biography if it had been written, as opposed to having been written in 1935 by one of his followers or something like that. I really do think he's due for full biographical treatment given his importance. And so that's what I'm going to be working on next.
Wow. That's exciting.
Yeah. Well,
Well, I'll be sure to put the links for Humanistic Letters in the description below. But Eric Adler, once again, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
thank you so much, James. It's wonderful to talk to you.